The decision did not arrive with fireworks or a grand speech, but with a thermostat that blinked and refused to cooperate. Jonah Mercer stood in his kitchen with a small screwdriver in one hand and a mug of reheated coffee in the other, watching cold air creep along the tile like it had a schedule. He was 38, a single father, and the kind of man who kept a home together through routine and quiet effort. His daughter Ava, 10, taped paper snowflakes to the window before school, and his son Miles, 6, fell asleep clutching a plastic reindeer like it could hold back winter. Jonah's mother lived in the back bedroom after a mild stroke, proud enough to insist she was fine, tired enough that her voice went thin at night. The holidays were close, the house looked cheerful from the street, and Jonah felt the familiar pressure of wanting his kids to remember warmth instead of worry. A repair estimate sat on the counter with a number that made his jaw tighten, because it was the kind of bill that did not care about Christmas lights, grocery lists, or medication refills. He carried 3 jobs in one body: maintenance tech by day, emergency handyman after hours, and caregiver whenever his mother's hands shook too much to button her sweater. The extra shifts helped, but not fast enough, and Jonah hated the way money could turn every small choice into a math problem. He had already sold his old guitar, canceled the kids' weekend movie habit, and delayed his own dental work until chewing on one side became normal. He told himself he was being responsible, yet responsibility still felt like sinking sand when the furnace refused to start. One evening, after a long call replacing a tenant's busted water line, he sat in his truck and scrolled his phone to avoid going into the cold house too soon. A short video popped up of people bidding on abandoned storage units, laughing when they found junk and yelling when they found treasure. Jonah almost closed it, then watched another, then another, because the idea of a single lucky break felt like a glass of water when you have been swallowing dust. He did not fantasize about yachts or jackpots. He pictured a working furnace, a paid-off credit card, and a new year that did not begin with an overdue notice. 2 days later, during a lunch run for bolts and pipe tape, Jonah saw a flyer taped to the counter by the register. It advertised a year-end storage auction, premium units included, with a note that payment was due immediately and cleanup had a strict window. He stared at it longer than he meant to, and the clerk gave him a bored smile that said this was normal. Jonah took a photo of the flyer and tried to forget it, but the thought followed him through the afternoon like a low hum. That night, while the kids colored by the tree and his mother dozed in her chair, he opened the auction site and scrolled through listings. Most photos showed the usual clutter. Mattresses leaning like tired walls, plastic bins, old appliances, cardboard softened by time. Then he found one unit marked premium, priced far above the others, and the picture looked staged in a way that made his skin prickle. The front showed ordinary junk, boxes, blankets, a bicycle wheel, yet everything sat in deliberate rows, and the back half of the unit disappeared under stacked tarps as if someone had tried to hide bulk without making it obvious. Jonah zoomed in until the image broke into pixels and noticed small details that did not belong in random trash. 2 identical padlocks cut cleanly and left on the floor, a hand truck pushed into the corner, and a faint strip of blue painter's tape on the concrete marked with a single letter. Jonah did not tell himself it was fate, because he had learned not to romanticize. He told himself it was probably nothing, and the price was probably high for a reason that would disappoint him. Still, the thought of letting it pass felt like watching a door close while his hands were full and helpless. He brought the listing up again in the morning, then again that afternoon, measuring the numbers the way he measured groceries at checkout. His mother noticed the tightness in his shoulders and asked what he was staring at, and Jonah kept it simple because he did not want pity in the room. He said he might bid on a storage unit to flip a few items, just enough to handle the furnace repair without borrowing. She watched him for a long moment, then said, "Don't gamble with the kids' heat," in a voice that carried love and warning in equal measure. Jonah promised he would not, and he meant it, which was why he set a hard limit and wrote it on paper like an oath. When Miles ran in and asked if they could still see the neighborhood lights before New Year's, Jonah said yes even though he did not know how, because fathers are allowed to lie only in the direction of hope. The auction went live the next evening, and Jonah sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open, the space heater humming at his feet like a tired animal. Bids climbed fast on the normal units, then slowed when the premium listing came up, as if the room of strangers behind the screens hesitated together. Jonah watched usernames appear and vanish, watched the price rise in small steps, and felt his pulse match the countdown clock. Ava leaned over his shoulder and whispered a question about why people would buy someone else's leftovers, and Jonah gave her the gentlest version of the truth. He said sometimes people find something useful and sometimes they just want a story to tell. Ava, who spent her free time watching craft videos, told him that if someone makes something good, you should leave a like and a comment so they keep going, because support matters when work is hard. Jonah almost laughed at the timing, then felt his throat tighten, because support was exactly what he needed and exactly what he hated asking for. He rubbed his palms on his jeans, waited until the last seconds, and placed one bid that sat inside his limit like a controlled breath. The screen refreshed, the timer snapped to 0, and a confirmation line appeared with no celebration, just cold certainty. He had won. He drove to the storage facility the next morning under a pale winter sun, his stomach full of nerves instead of breakfast. The manager at the office window checked Jonah's receipt and slid paperwork across with the practiced tone of someone who had seen every kind of buyer. He reminded Jonah that the sale was final, that the unit could contain anything, and that removal had to happen on schedule. Jonah signed, paid, and accepted a ring of keys that felt too light for the choice he had made. The manager added one detail without looking up as if it did not matter, and that was what made it matter. The premium unit, he said, had been paid in cash for a long time, always on time until the payments stopped without a call. Jonah asked carefully if anyone ever came back to check, and the manager shook his head. Jonah walked the rows of metal doors with a borrowed handcart and the sound of distant roll-ups echoing like hollow thunder. He reached his unit at the far end, where the lane felt quieter and the air smelled of dust and old fabric, and he stood there long enough to hear his own breathing settle. When Jonah lifted the door, the first thing he saw was disappointment dressed as normalcy. Stained mattresses, collapsing boxes, mismatched kitchen chairs, and a heap of blankets that looked like someone had moved in and then given up. The second thing he saw was the bicycle at the front, not propped casually but positioned like a barrier, as if it had been placed to make the unit look worse than it was. He stepped inside and felt grit crunch under his boots, then noticed the floor near the back was cleaner, a narrow path swept through the mess with quiet intention. Under the largest blanket pile, something rounded pressed upward in a repeating pattern, too uniform to be random trash. Jonah lifted one corner and heard a soft, dull clink that did not sound like tools or glass, but like many small pieces settling together. He froze, blanket still in his hand because the sound carried weight, and the shape beneath the fabric rose in tall, identical cylinders lined up like soldiers. Jonah lowered the blanket again and looked back toward the open lane, suddenly aware that he was alone, that the facility felt too still, and that he had just bought more than junk. If those covered cylinders were what he feared they might be, then why had someone hidden them under the mess instead of taking them away, and why did the air in the unit smell faintly of metal, like a secret that had been waiting to be disturbed? Jonah kept the blanket lifted just long enough to confirm the shapes were real, then lowered it again as if the unit might notice his attention. He stood there, listening to the distant slam of other roll-up doors and the thin whine of wind between rows, trying to decide whether his next move should be bold or careful. The mess in front of him looked ordinary on purpose, like someone had staged a bad unit for buyers who only glanced inside. A torn mattress leaned against the left wall, and a stack of taped boxes sagged near the entrance, yet the concrete path leading deeper was strangely clean. Jonah nudged a cardboard flap with his boot and saw fresh scuff marks beneath the dust, the kind made by something heavy being shifted recently. He pulled the blanket back again, slower this time, and the dull clinking returned, multiplied, as if thousands of tiny pieces had been waiting for air. Underneath stood a neat line of clear plastic water jugs, the big kind used for office coolers, their sides cloudy with age and their caps tightened hard. There were far more than he expected, 2 rows deep, almost 20 in all, and every jug was filled to the neck with coins. Not a few handfuls, not a jar of spare change, but dense, packed metal that pressed against the plastic in uneven layers. Jonah's throat went dry. He had spent his life sorting screws, wire, and pipes by feel, and he could tell by the sound alone that this was not just pennies and nickels. It was heavier, sharper, and mixed like someone dumped whole rolls in with loose change and never bothered to separate it again. He crouched and braced one jug with both hands, testing the weight without lifting it fully, and the strain jumped straight into his forearms. The coins inside were not uniform. He could see different colors through the plastic, copper and silver tones, dull gray edges, and the occasional flash of something brighter where a clean coin face pressed against the side. He twisted the cap carefully, expecting it to be stuck, and it gave with a short squeak, releasing a faint dry smell like old paper and metal that had sat too long. Jonah tipped the jug slightly and let a small cascade roll into his palm. Quarters, dimes, a few pennies, but also older designs he recognized from childhood coin folders, faces and eagles that looked unfamiliar beside modern mint marks. One coin had a worn date that made him blink twice before he trusted it, because it belonged to a decade his mother talked about like it was yesterday. Another was a thick silver-colored piece with a different edge pattern, not a token but something that looked like it came from a set. Jonah did not let himself jump to wild conclusions, because excitement makes people stupid, and stupid gets families hurt. He set the coins back into the jug, tightened the cap, and looked around the unit again with fresh eyes. The junk piles were not random, they were cover. Someone had worked hard to make these jugs look like nothing more than heavy buckets under blankets, the kind you would assume held rocks, sand, or old paint cans. Jonah felt a surge of heat behind his ribs, half relief and half dread, because the coins could solve his furnace problem, but they also raised a new problem he could not name yet. He forced himself into a routine, the same way he handled a flooded apartment or a broken heater call at midnight. First, he documented. Jonah pulled out his phone and took slow, wide photos of the whole unit, then closer shots of the jugs, the blankets, the clean path on the floor, the cut padlocks near the back corner, and the odd strip of painter's tape on the concrete. He wrote the time in his notes app and took a photo of his own receipt because if anyone ever questioned what he did, he wanted a timeline that did not depend on memory. Then he started sorting the normal items, because he needed to understand what else he had bought besides a hidden wall of money. Under one mattress he found a cracked plastic tote holding children's holiday decorations, cheap ornaments, a tangled string of lights, a Santa hat with dust in the white trim, and the sight hit him harder than he expected. Whoever hid these coins had once owned ordinary things too, which meant this was not just a clever stash, it was part of a life. Jonah found a small folding chair near the back, positioned like someone had sat there watching the door, and beside it a flattened cardboard tray that smelled faintly of takeout grease. He pictured a person coming here at night, counting, sorting, and listening for footsteps, and Jonah's skin tightened with unease. An hour later, when he stepped outside to breathe and warm his hands, he saw the manager's office window across the lot and noticed a dark sedan parked near the entrance lane, engine off, facing toward the rows. It could have been another customer, and Jonah told himself that twice, but the longer he stood there, the more the stillness of the car felt deliberate. He went back to his own vehicle and sat with the door closed, letting his heartbeat settle while the heater blew weak warm air against his knuckles. He thought about Ava's paper snowflakes, Miles's reindeer, and his mother's thin warning voice, and he understood the real stake of the moment. If he handled this like a lucky idiot, he could lose everything, including the safety he had fought for since his wife left years earlier. If he handled it like a careful man, he might finally give his kids a holiday that did not carry fear underneath it. Jonah texted his neighbor to ask if she could check on his mother for an hour, keeping the message casual, then returned to the unit with a borrowed hand cart and the kind of focus he used when he had to fix something expensive with limited tools. Halfway through the work, Ava called from school to ask if he could still come to her winter concert, and Jonah promised yes because he meant it. After he hung up, he caught himself wishing there were a way for decent people to show up without being asked twice, the way his kids click support buttons on the videos they loved. It made him think not about the internet but about the simple truth behind it. When people care, they stay engaged. Jonah decided that if he got through this cleanly, he would accept help when it was offered and stop pretending he could carry everything alone, and he would remember the small kindnesses the way others remember likes, subscribes, and thoughtful comments that keep a good thing alive. By early afternoon he had moved enough clutter to see the back wall clearly, and the coin jugs became even more shocking in the open light. Someone had arranged them in tight rows, like inventory, and placed blankets and empty paint buckets in front as camouflage. Jonah counted quickly and got 19 jugs, then found a 20th tucked behind a rolled rug, as if it mattered more than the rest. That jug had a strip of tape on the side with 3 handwritten letters and a date, and the neatness of the writing made Jonah pause. He opened it and poured a careful handful into a small plastic dish he found in a box, and this time the mix looked different. There were more older pieces, more silver tones, and several coins in clear plastic flips like a collector would use. Jonah's breath caught when he saw one flip labeled in tidy ink, not with a value but with a note. Keep, do not spend. He set that jug aside and kept sorting, and behind a stack of flattened boxes he found a metal cash box, the kind a church raffle might use, locked and heavier than it should have been. Next to it sat a plain brown envelope sealed with tape, tucked beneath an outdated calendar page that showed a December tree and a handwritten reminder, "Pay before holiday." Jonah did not open the envelope yet. He felt the weight of his own curiosity like a hand pushing at his back, but he refused to let curiosity outrun caution. He loaded 2 jugs onto the handcart to test whether he could move them safely, and the cart's wheels protested, squealing across the concrete. He realized immediately that clearing this unit alone would take multiple trips and attract attention, and attention was the last thing he wanted while hauling what might be thousands of dollars in loose metal. Jonah's first practical step was not selling anything, but confirming what he had before he made a single decision that could not be undone. Late that afternoon he drove to a small coin shop in the older part of town, carrying only a small sample in a zip bag and 2 coins in flips, nothing that screamed treasure, just enough to get an honest reaction. The shop smelled like paper and old carpet, and the man behind the counter looked like he had been weighing metal his entire life. Jonah kept his story simple, calling it a storage unit find and nothing more, and he asked what the coins looked like on first glance. The man poured the sample into a tray, leaned close, and his expression shifted from polite boredom to focused attention in a way Jonah felt in his stomach. He checked edges, dates, and mint marks, then set 2 pieces aside with careful fingers and asked Jonah quietly if he had more like these. Jonah answered with one short nod and watched the man choose his next words. The estimate he gave was cautious, not a fantasy, and he made sure Jonah understood the difference between face value, scrap value, and collector value, because mixed jugs meant mixed outcomes. Still, when the man told him that some older silver coins could add up quickly and that rare pieces should never be cleaned or rushed into a pawn sale, Jonah felt his eyes sting with relief he did not want to show. He thanked the man, asked about proper appraisals and documentation, and left with a card and one hard instruction ringing in his head. Move carefully because people overhear things. When Jonah returned to the facility, the sun sat low and cold, and the rows of doors looked longer than they had that morning. He walked toward his unit and stopped short because the lock looked different. It was still closed, still intact, but the metal around it carried fresh scratches that had not been there before, and a thin line of dust on the latch had been disturbed, as if someone had tested it with a finger and then wiped nothing else. Jonah did not panic, but his pulse climbed fast, and he scanned the lane the way he scanned dark parking lots after late-night repair calls. The dark sedan was gone from the entrance, yet the air felt watched as if his return had been expected. He unlocked the unit, lifted the door only halfway and listened before stepping inside. Everything looked the same at first glance, but one blanket fold near the jug sat differently, and the handcart he had left against the wall had been nudged a few inches. Jonah's mouth went dry. He knew what it meant when an object moved without permission, because he had fixed enough broken doors to understand intent. He backed out slowly, lowered the roll-up door, and locked it again with hands that did not shake until he got back to his truck. Then he sat behind the wheel, staring at the key in his palm, because the coins were no longer just a solution for his family. They were a signal to someone else, and Jonah could feel it, clear as winter air. Whatever he had uncovered, somebody had been waiting for a chance to take it back. A scraped padlock can make a man feel watched, even when the lane looks empty and the sky stays perfectly calm. Jonah sat in his truck outside the storage row with both hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the rush in his chest until his thoughts lined up again. He had seen fresh scratches around his lock, a disturbed line of dust, a blanket fold that didn't match his own hands, and a handcart shifted as if someone tested its weight. None of those details proved a crime, yet every one of them carried intent, and intent was what scared him more than bad luck. He looked down the long corridor of metal doors and tried to imagine what kind of person returned to a sold unit after an auction, careful enough to leave almost nothing behind, bold enough to touch another man's property anyway. Jonah's mind kept jumping to his kids, because fear always takes the shortest path to what matters most. Ava had her winter concert coming up, Miles still believed every porch light meant someone was safe inside, and Jonah's mother depended on him for basics she no longer remembered to do. He wanted to storm back into the unit and drag every jug of coins into his truck, but that would take hours, draw eyes, and make him look guilty even if he wasn't. The most dangerous mistake would be acting like the coins were already his in a way no one could question. He stared at the key in his palm, then locked it in the glove compartment, not because it was secure there, but because he needed one physical reminder that he could still choose patience. He went straight to the office instead of the unit, forcing his steps to stay steady, and asked the manager to come outside and look at the lock with him. Jonah kept his voice low and simple, the way he talked to billing departments when he needed mercy and the way he talked to Miles when nightmares started. The manager's face tightened the second Jonah pointed out the scratches, and that expression gave Jonah a small, cold confirmation. The facility had seen trouble before and learned to pretend it was rare. The manager admitted the far lanes had weaker camera angles, especially near the back row, and said the best footage would be the gate log and the entry camera near the driveway. Jonah didn't argue about what should have been installed. Arguing would not rewind time. He asked calmly for the gate entry history for today and yesterday, and for a note in their incident binder that he reported tampering. The manager hesitated, then nodded, because paper trails matter to businesses as much as they matter to single fathers. Jonah also asked if anyone had asked about his unit since the auction, and the answer arrived with another half-second pause that felt like a crack in a door. The manager said a man had called that morning claiming he handled cleanouts, and wanted to know if Unit 12 was still available, then hung up quickly when told it had sold. Jonah didn't ask for a description. He asked for the phone number on the caller ID, and the manager wrote it down without looking Jonah in the eye. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread, and Jonah understood he would need threads if the situation turned into something heavier. Before he left, he asked for one more practical favor. If any employee saw someone lingering near his door, they should call him before confronting anyone. The manager agreed, then added one soft sentence that landed like a weight. People don't usually fight over coins, man. Jonah nodded once because that was exactly what he had been trying not to say out loud. On the drive home, Jonah took the long route through busier streets, not because he enjoyed wasting gas, but because he needed to know whether the dark sedan was more than a nervous idea. He watched his mirrors at stoplights and kept his turns normal, refusing to perform fear, yet one block after the grocery store he spotted the same shape slipping into the lane behind him. The sedan stayed 2 cars back, patient, never rushing, never falling too far behind, and Jonah's stomach tightened the way it did before bad news calls. He didn't speed. He didn't brake check. He did what he did when a plumbing job went sideways and panic tried to grab him by the throat. He made the situation public. Jonah turned into the parking lot of a big, bright hardware store where cameras covered every corner, parked near the entrance, and walked inside like he needed light bulbs. Through the glass doors he saw the sedan roll past the lot's front edge, slow down as if counting rows, then continue without parking. Jonah exhaled through his nose, anger and relief mixing into something sharp and steady. Whoever was curious about him did not want to be curious on camera. That was the first useful fact he had learned all day. He bought 2 cheap motion lights he didn't plan to return because the receipt would be a timestamp, then drove home again by a different route, keeping his phone in the cup holder and his mind on one clear priority. His family would not become the price of his good fortune. That night he kept the house ordinary on purpose, because kids can feel a father's fear even when he keeps his voice calm. Jonah reheated soup, helped Miles with a paper snowman craft, and listened to Ava complain about a teacher who assigned extra rehearsal during the week before Christmas. His mother sat in her chair under a knitted throw, watching the lights on the small tree blink in their slow pattern, and every so often she asked what day it was like the question might have changed. Jonah answered patiently, then checked the back door lock twice when no one was looking. After the kids went to bed, he pulled out the plastic dish of sample coins and spread them on a towel at the kitchen table, using a cheap magnifier and the coin shop's card beside him like a compass. He wasn't trying to become a collector overnight. He was trying to separate ordinary change from do not touch, so he wouldn't do something irreversible in a moment of stress. He found a few coins with silver edges that looked too clean for pocket change, and one older piece with a worn profile that made him think of his grandfather's stories. Jonah slid those into a small envelope and wrote the date on it, then took a picture of the envelope next to the day's newspaper, because proof calmed him more than prayers did lately. In the middle of all that, Ava padded into the kitchen for water and asked why he looked so serious. Jonah didn't lie, but he didn't dump the whole weight on her either. He told her he had bought something strange at a storage auction and needed to be careful with it, and she studied his face like she was older than her years. "Just, don't miss my concert," she said, quiet and firm. Jonah promised again, then watched her go, and he thought about how kids show support in the only way they know how, with attention and presence. If someone out there ever cared about a story enough to stick with it, Jonah understood that instinct now in a different way, because steady attention can keep a person from making lonely decisions. He would have given a lot for a simple sign that he wasn't walking this line alone, the way people tap like, subscribe, and leave a comment when they want something good to continue, not because it changes reality, but because it reminds the person carrying the weight that someone is still listening. The next morning Jonah did the first truly responsible thing he could afford, even though it stole time he didn't have. He went to the bank and opened a small safe deposit box in his own name, using the last of his emergency cash to pay the fee without flinching. He brought only the notebook page he found in the unit, the caller's phone number written from the manager's pad, the envelope of do not touch coins, and the one labeled flip that said keep, do not spend. The box was not a magic shield, yet it gave him a place where his most sensitive pieces couldn't vanish in one break-in or one bad moment. From the bank he drove to the non-emergency police desk in the same calm, practical way he paid bills he hated. He didn't accuse anyone by name. He reported a suspicious attempt at his lock, a possible tailing car near the storage property, and a concern that someone might be trying to pressure him about a legal auction purchase. The officer on duty took notes, asked for the storage address, and told Jonah something Jonah already knew but still needed to hear. If anyone contacts you directly, do not meet them alone. Jonah gave his statement, took the report number, and left with a strange mix of embarrassment and relief. He wasn't a man who liked involving law enforcement in his life, yet he also wasn't a man who could pretend his children were protected by silence. On the way out, he sat in his truck and stared at the report number written on a folded paper, because that small sequence of digits meant the situation was now real in a way that mattered to more than his nerves. By late afternoon, Jonah returned to the storage facility at the busiest hour he could manage, when renters came and went and the lane stayed loud enough to swallow quiet threats. He brought a small tool bag, a cheap battery camera, and a new lock that looked more serious than the one he'd been using because appearances can be a kind of deterrent. He worked in careful steps, never leaving the unit open longer than necessary, never blocking the lane, never acting like he owned a jackpot. First he mounted the motion camera inside the unit facing the door, tucked high enough that a quick glance wouldn't catch it. Then he placed a plain cardboard box near the entrance labeled "Clothes" in thick marker, because plain boxes don't attract thieves, yet they create a visual marker if someone shifts them. He did not move the coin jugs that day. He covered them again, arranged the blankets in a pattern he memorized, and took one last photo before closing up, because the goal wasn't to win a tug-of-war over the coins with brute strength. The goal was to catch the person who kept testing him, or at least to make that person nervous enough to slip. As Jonah locked the door, he noticed a new detail on the concrete near the back corner, half hidden beneath dust. A smudge that looked like rubber, like a cartwheel, had been turned sharply there. He crouched, touched it lightly, and felt a faint tackiness that didn't match the dry grit around it. Jonah stood, swallowed hard, and forced himself to walk out without looking over his shoulder too many times. He hated how quickly his life had shifted from pay the furnace bill to document the floor, yet the shift felt unavoidable now, like stepping onto ice and realizing the surface is thinner than you believed. That evening the waves of normal life tried to return, because the calendar didn't care about Jonah's fear. Ava's concert arrived with its usual chaos of folding chairs, paper programs, and parents filming with shaky phones. And Jonah showed up early because he refused to let a shadow steal this moment from his daughter. He found seats near the aisle so he could see the doors, then hated himself for even thinking that way because a school gym should not feel like a place to plan exits. Ava stood with her choir in a simple sweater and a nervous smile that melted Jonah's heart, and for a few minutes he let the music pull him back into being only a father. He clapped too hard, laughed when Miles waved from the front row, and smiled at his mother's soft humming beside him, because she remembered melodies even when she forgot dates. When the concert ended and families began bundling children into coats, Jonah felt his phone buzz, once, then again, and he glanced down expecting a work call. Instead he saw a text from an unknown number, no greeting, no hesitation, just one sentence that made his blood run cold. "You changed the lock, but not the problem." Jonah looked up instinctively toward the gym doors, and through the glass he caught a glimpse of a dark sedan idling under the parking lot lights, positioned like it had been waiting for the crowd to thin. The gym parking lot looked festive from a distance, all string lights and candy cane cones, but Jonah Hale could feel the night tightening around him the moment that dark sedan settled near the far curb. He guided Ava and Miles toward the truck without rushing, keeping his shoulders loose so the kids wouldn't read panic in his posture. Yet every nerve in his body tracked the sedan's position like a heat source. Ava chatted about a missed note in the second verse, Miles swung the paper program like a flag, and Jonah's mother Ruth walked carefully at his side, her gloved hand tucked into his elbow as if he were the rail. The phone in Jonah's pocket buzzed once more and he didn't need to look to remember the words. "You changed the lock, but not the problem." He opened the truck door, loaded everyone in, and waited until seatbelts clicked before starting the engine, because he refused to hand fear an extra inch. As he pulled out, he took the longest route through bright streets lined with wreaths and blow-up reindeer, choosing traffic over isolation, cameras over darkness. The sedan followed for 3 turns, then peeled away at a light, disappearing into the stream like it had never been there. Jonah didn't celebrate that. People who vanish that cleanly don't quit, they simply change their angle. When he finally turned onto his street, he saw his porch light glowing warm over the small plastic nativity Miles insisted on placing each year, and Jonah felt the stakes sharpen into one clean sentence. Whatever those coin jugs were worth, he would not let them buy danger into his children's home. He kept the house calm with practiced effort, the way he used to keep calm during midnight fevers and overdue notices. Ruth settled into her chair with a blanket and a mug of cocoa she would forget to drink. Ava took a long shower to wash off concert nerves, and Miles fell asleep still holding a paper snowflake he had cut unevenly at school. Jonah waited until the kitchen was quiet, then pulled out the printed police report number he had folded into his wallet and dialed the non-emergency line again, asking for a call back from the detective assigned to suspicious property and theft cases. He didn't mention coins at first. He mentioned tampering, tailing, and a direct text from an unknown number after he filed a report, because those were the parts that mattered to safety. The call came back within an hour, and the detective's voice was clipped but not dismissive, the tone of someone used to sorting real problems from exaggerated ones. Jonah kept his answers steady, giving times, places, and the storage facility's gate camera situation, and the detective asked one question that made Jonah's throat tighten. Had he told anyone how valuable the unit might be? Jonah said no because he hadn't, not even to friends, not even to the guys at work, not even to his ex who called only when she needed something. The detective told him to save the text, avoid meeting anyone, and return to the facility only in daylight and only when other renters were present, then promised to contact the manager about footage and gate logs. Jonah hung up and sat at the table with both hands flat on the wood, letting his pulse slow. He wanted a clean, simple ending where a man finds coins and pays bills, but the world rarely offers clean endings to people who live quietly. It offers choices. Jonah looked at the Christmas card Ava had taped to the fridge, 4 stick figures, a crooked tree, and the words "We made it," and he understood he would make whatever choice kept that sentence true. The next day brought a thin gray winter sun and the kind of cold that makes metal doors complain. Jonah took Ruth to her appointment first because normal responsibilities don't pause for danger, then drove the kids to school with extra reminders about staying with friends and not wandering after class. Only after that did he head to the storage facility, arriving at the busiest hour he could manage, when pickups rolled in and carts squeaked across gravel. He met the manager at the office counter and spoke quietly, showing the man his new lock receipt, the photo of the scratches and the text message timestamp, while the manager's eyes kept flicking toward the window as if he wished none of this had landed on his property. The detective had already called because the manager's posture changed the moment Jonah mentioned her name, and he agreed to pull gate footage and entry camera clips. Jonah didn't demand to watch it on the spot. He asked for a copy to be sent directly to the detective, because that kept the chain of custody clean and kept Jonah from turning into the kind of guy who argues over blurry screens. Before walking down the lane, he bought one more practical layer of safety with money he hated spending. A facility-approved motion sensor for the unit door, installed under the manager's supervision so no one could later claim Jonah altered the lock area. The manager muttered that it was a lot of trouble for a storage buy, and Jonah answered with a calm he didn't fully feel, telling him trouble had already shown up and he was simply choosing where to hold the line. He walked toward the unit with his breath visible in the air, the holiday music from the office radio fading behind him, and he felt the difference between being curious and being targeted. Curiosity feels like a door opening. Being targeted feels like a door closing behind you. Inside the unit, Jonah moved slowly, making his actions easy to explain later. He checked the small battery camera he had mounted high and saw it had recorded 2 short clips overnight. One of nothing but shadows from passing headlights, and one of a figure stopping at his door for less than a minute, close enough to block the view, then leaving without forcing the lock. That detail hit Jonah harder than a broken latch would have, because it suggested the person wasn't trying to steal yet, they were trying to communicate control. He didn't touch the coin jugs right away. He took wide photos of the whole unit, then close photos of the blankets, the carts, and the floor marks, building a record the way a careful parent builds routines. Small actions that make chaos harder. The unit itself still looked like a dump from the front. Stained mattresses, a bent bike frame, bins of old towels, a cracked mirror, and stacked cardboard that smelled faintly of dust and detergent. Only the back corner held the 20 tall water jugs that looked like ordinary emergency water storage until you lifted a blanket and heard the unmistakable dense rattle of coins. Jonah opened one jug just enough to confirm it was still full, then resealed it with tape exactly as before. He told himself he would not start hauling them today because hauling would turn him into a spectacle, and spectacle was what the dark sedan wanted. He chose one smaller container instead, an old toolbox from beneath a mattress heavy for its size, and carried it to the front where light was better. Inside were gloves, zip ties, a cheap scale, and a worn notebook with dates and short notes written in tight block letters. One page held a list of numbers that looked like unit codes and gate times, and at the bottom, underlined twice, were 3 words Jonah did not like seeing in anyone else's handwriting. If found, move fast. Halfway through his sorting, Jonah's phone buzzed with a message from Ava. A short video clip from the concert, her voice wobbly but proud, and a caption that made his chest ache in the simplest way. She wrote that her teacher posted the class performance online, and if Jonah could he should like it, subscribe to the school channel and leave a comment, because the choir needed support for next year's funding. Jonah stared at those words while standing in a storage unit that felt like a trap, and the contrast almost made him laugh, except it wasn't funny. It was a reminder that support is not just a digital habit. It is a real thing that keeps good people from getting pushed off the road by louder forces. Jonah did what he always did for his kids when he felt powerless in bigger places. He acted where he could. He liked the video, left a short comment praising the kids' courage, and promised Ava he would be there for rehearsal help if she needed it. Then he slid his phone back into his pocket and let that small normal act steady him. He couldn't control who watched his unit, but he could control whether his children felt alone in their own lives. With his breathing calmer, he returned to the toolbox notebook and photographed every page, because the handwriting looked like a plan that stretched beyond coins. The list of unit codes suggested someone had used the facility like a map, moving items across multiple doors instead of one, and Jonah felt his stomach tighten as he realized the jugs might not be the only hidden thing he had purchased by accident. The detective arrived late afternoon in an unmarked sedan that looked like any other car in the lot, which was the point. She was younger than Jonah expected, eyes sharp, movements economical, and she didn't waste time with dramatic reactions when Jonah showed her the camera clip, the text, and the notebook. She asked him to walk her through the unit exactly as it had appeared at purchase, and Jonah did, pointing out where mattresses blocked sight lines and where the jugs sat under blankets that made them look like trash or water storage. She didn't touch the coins, she photographed the jug tops, the seals, and the serial markings on the plastic, then asked the manager for gate logs and camera footage to cross-check times against the notebook scribbles. The manager hovered nearby, nervous but cooperative, and Jonah noticed how quickly a place feels different when someone with authority stands in it. The air doesn't get warmer, but it gets less lonely. The detective explained in plain terms that large amounts of coins can be legitimate, estate cleanouts, hoarder caches, old businesses, yet they also appear in theft cases because coins are hard to trace once mixed. She asked Jonah what his plan had been before the threat started, and Jonah answered honestly, pay the furnace repair, catch up on debt, keep his kids' lives steady, and maybe take Ruth to a doctor who didn't rush through appointments. The detective listened without judgment, then said one practical thing Jonah needed to hear. If the coins were stolen, keeping them could become complicated, but reporting threats and documenting everything was already the right first step. Jonah watched her bag the notebook as evidence with a receipt, and he felt two emotions collide, relief that someone else now carried part of the weight, and fear that the weight might be heavier than he guessed. As they talked, a gray sedan rolled slowly past the lane entrance, not stopping, not parking, just passing like a slow blink, and the detective's gaze followed it without her head turning. She asked Jonah quietly whether that looked like the car from the concert night. Jonah didn't answer with certainty he didn't have. He answered with the truth, it felt the same. The plan they built was not heroic. It was careful, and careful was what Jonah could live with. The detective arranged for the facility manager to keep the main gate camera recording continuously for the next 2 evenings and asked Jonah to return at a specific time when the lot was busy, carrying 2 containers that looked heavy and valuable. The idea was simple. The person sending texts wanted Jonah to move fast, and people who want control often show themselves when they believe the other side is about to hand them what they want. Jonah hated the thought of baiting anyone, but he hated more the thought of being cornered in the dark with his kids at home. He agreed on one condition that mattered to him more than pride. The operation would happen while his children were with a neighbor, and Ruth would stay with them so no one could decide his house was the softer target. The detective accepted that without pushback, and Jonah felt a small respect bloom through his fear. That evening he arranged the simple safety net, dropping the kids at a kind neighbor's house under the excuse of holiday errands and helping Ruth settle in with her crossword book. Then Jonah drove back to the facility with 2 decoy bins in his trunk, packed with old tools and scrap metal to mimic weight without risking evidence. He walked into the lane slowly, made a show of struggling with one bin, and glanced toward the cameras like he didn't know they mattered. Minutes passed. A cart rattled. A door slammed. Then the gray sedan appeared again, rolling in with its lights off until it cleared the gate, stopping 2 rows away like it belonged there. A man stepped out, hands in his pockets, moving toward Jonah's unit with the casual confidence of someone who expected Jonah to obey. The man didn't raise his voice, and that restraint made him more frightening than a shouting bully. He stopped a few feet from Jonah, eyes flicking to the bins, then to Jonah's lock, then to Jonah's face as if matching him to a photo. Jonah kept his hands visible and his posture calm, because panic is what people like this feed on. The man said one short line, almost polite, telling Jonah to do the right thing, and leave the bins inside the unit with the door cracked. Jonah didn't answer with anger. He answered with time. He set the bin down, adjusted the lid as if considering it, and shifted his body slightly so the camera line would catch his face, just as the detective instructed. The man took one more step forward, and in that moment the lane changed. Two plainclothes officers appeared from between rows as if the shadows themselves had decided to stand up, and the detective walked in behind them with her badge visible and her voice firm. The man's expression didn't collapse into panic, it tightened into calculation, then he tried to back away toward the sedan. One officer blocked his path without touching him, and the detective told him to keep his hands out of his pockets. The man smiled thinly as if the world still owed him options, and Jonah felt his stomach drop when he realized the man wasn't surprised by police presence. He looked almost relieved, like he had finally forced the story into the shape he wanted. As the officers moved to detain him, the man turned his head just enough to look at Jonah and said a single sentence that landed like ice. "Those coins aren't the problem, Father." Jonah's breath caught hard, because Jonah had never told anyone at the facility he had children, and the man had just proven he already knew. The lane stayed quiet after the officers moved in, yet Jonah Hale felt like the world had tipped onto a sharper edge. The man in the gray sedan did not yell or fight. He simply let the handcuffs close with a thin, annoyed smile, as if he expected Jonah to understand a private rule that nobody had explained. Jonah kept his face steady for the cameras, but his stomach tightened when the man used that one word, "Father," like it was proof he had been studying Jonah's life. The detective guided Jonah a few steps away from the unit, keeping the conversation low and practical while other renters kept loading boxes, unaware they were walking through the center of a trap. Jonah watched the gray sedan get searched with careful gloves, watched an officer pull out a second phone and a small stack of printed photos, and he knew those photos were not of coins. They were of his street, his porch light, his kids getting out of the truck, Ruth being helped up the front steps. The holiday lights around the facility suddenly looked cheap and fragile, like props in the wrong story. Jonah's first impulse was to run home, but he forced himself to stand still, because running would tell the wrong people that fear had control. The detective told him, calmly, that the arrest alone did not erase the risk, because the man had not been operating on courage, he had been operating on confidence, and confidence usually comes from a team. Jonah nodded, absorbing each word like a set of instructions because this was not about pride anymore. It was about keeping Ava and Miles out of a problem they never asked for, and keeping Ruth from spending another winter with her heart braced for bad news. When they finally walked back to the office, the manager handed over gate logs and a copy of the entry footage, and Jonah saw the same plate number roll past the gate on 3 separate days, always at night, always lingering. That pattern hit him hardest, because it meant the unit had been watched long before Jonah ever touched a blanket. Whoever stacked those water jugs full of coins had expected to retrieve them, and Jonah's bid had simply interrupted the schedule. The next 24 hours moved in slow, careful steps, the way real crises do when nobody is trying to make a show. The detective asked Jonah to come to the station to give a statement and to sign for a temporary property hold, because the coin jugs had become evidence the moment the threat turned physical. Jonah hated the idea of evidence, because evidence sounded like a future made of court dates and paperwork, and he already had enough paperwork to last a lifetime. Still, he understood the logic. If the coins were connected to theft, the cleanest path was the one that started with honesty and ended with receipts, not rumors. At home, he kept everything ordinary on purpose. He made grilled cheese for the kids, helped Ava wrap a small gift for Ruth, and let Miles put the star on the tree even though it leaned. He did not tell them about printed photos or the word father being used like a knife, because children carry fear like wet clothes, and he refused to send them into Christmas break soaked in it. He told Ruth more because Ruth deserved truth, and because she had earned the right to help steer the family through hard weather. She listened without dramatics, then asked one simple question that steadied Jonah more than sympathy ever could. Had he done anything reckless that would make this his fault? Jonah told her no, and he meant it, and Ruth nodded as if locking that fact into place. The detective later confirmed what the notebook suggested when she laid it out in plain language. The coins were not the only asset being tracked. The notebook's unit codes matched 2 other delinquent accounts at the same facility, both cleared out days before auction, both paid in cash, both connected to the same gate plate. The man in the sedan, it turned out, was not a cop and not a coin collector. He worked for a shady asset location outfit that offered quiet retrieval services to people who did not want police reports and did not ask lawful questions. He had been sent when the original renter vanished and the facility posted the unit for sale, because someone assumed a frightened bidder would trade silence for safety. Jonah felt sick when he realized how common that assumption was, and how many people must have folded under it. What made the story finally make sense was not a shocking secret, but a small, believable one. The detective told Jonah that the coins had likely come from an elderly estate burglary 3 counties over, a case that never made big news because the victims were quiet people and the stolen items were only coins. An older couple had spent decades filling buckets with change, wheat pennies, silver halves, and the occasional rare piece they bought at flea markets, believing they were building a modest cushion for retirement. The couple died within months of each other, and a distant relative hired a caretaker to clean the house. The caretaker found the coin stash, reported no valuables, and disappeared before the family arrived. The burglary case had stalled because coins are hard to identify once mixed, and because most families do not keep photo catalogs of buckets. Jonah listened, picturing someone's grandfather sorting coins at the kitchen table, and he felt a twist of anger on their behalf. The detective explained that the caretaker had likely used storage units the way some people use shoeboxes, spreading risk across multiple doors and paying in cash to avoid traceable patterns. The water jugs were a clever disguise because they looked like emergency supplies, and they were heavy enough that staff would not casually move them. Jonah's super expensive unit listing, the one that pulled him in by instinct, was expensive because a few bidders had noticed the weight and the order, and because someone inside the gray sedan's world had tried to keep ordinary people from bidding at all. That last piece mattered because it meant Jonah's decision had not just changed his own life, it had broken a quiet pipeline that depended on everyone else staying cautious and obedient. The detective also told Jonah the line that haunted him was part of the tactic. The man had done enough digging to learn Jonah was a single father, then used that identity as pressure, counting on Jonah to trade anything for peace. Jonah felt shame for the fear he had carried into his own house, but the detective's tone stayed steady, reminding him that fear was not weakness, it was information. Jonah had listened to it and chosen documentation instead of impulse, and that choice had kept the danger visible enough to stop. 2 evenings later, with Christmas only days away, the detective asked Jonah to help with one more careful step, and she made sure he understood he could refuse. The goal was not drama, it was clarity. They wanted to identify who hired the asset man and who else might still be circling the coins. Jonah agreed because he was tired of being nudged by strangers in the dark, and because he wanted the pressure to end before the holidays turned into a season of locked doors and sleepless checks at the window. The setup was simple and public. Jonah would arrive at the facility during the busiest hour, carry a single empty jug sealed with tape, and place it in the unit as if he were preparing a handoff. Officers would watch from ordinary cars, and the manager would keep the gate camera live. Jonah did not love the idea of being visible, but he loved even less the idea of being predictable at home. That afternoon, Ava sent him another choir clip, a short rehearsal video filmed under warm classroom lights, and Jonah watched it in the truck before stepping out, letting the normal sound of children singing steady his breathing. Ruth, sitting beside him, smiled softly and said the school was trying to raise funds for spring uniforms, and Ava kept reminding everyone that small support mattered. Jonah nodded and told Ruth he had already left a like and a comment for the kids, because small encouragement keeps good work alive, especially when people feel unseen. Ruth patted his hand and told him to remember that the same rule applied to grown-ups too, which was her way of saying he did not have to carry the whole mess alone. Jonah walked into the facility with the sealed empty jug in his arms, felt the cold plastic against his coat, and for the first time in days he noticed the music playing from someone's radio near the loading bay. It was a carol, slightly tinny, and it made the moment feel strangely human, because life kept insisting on being ordinary even while danger tried to sharpen it. The watchers showed themselves faster than Jonah expected, which told him they had been waiting for any excuse to act. A pickup rolled in and parked 2 lanes over, and a man stepped out pretending to check a unit lock while his eyes tracked Jonah's hands. Another figure lingered near the gate, too still to be a casual renter, shoulders angled to keep sight lines open. Jonah placed the jug inside his unit, left the door cracked just enough to look careless, then walked away slowly, letting his boots crunch gravel at an unhurried pace. He did not look back because the detective had warned him that looking back can be read as invitation or weakness. He reached the end of the lane, stopped beside the manager's office window, and waited as if checking a receipt on his phone. Within minutes, the pickup's driver moved toward Jonah's unit, and the gate lurker drifted closer, both men using the same casual body language as the gray sedan man had used, the language of people who expect compliance. Then the quiet snapped into motion without shouting. Officers stepped in from 2 directions, blocking exits, and the detective approached with her badge visible, voice firm, telling them to stop and keep their hands where she could see them. Jonah watched one man freeze in surprise and another attempt a slow retreat, and he felt something shift inside him, a release that was not triumph but relief. These men were not ghosts. They were not unstoppable. They were just people who had relied on intimidation, and intimidation collapses quickly when it is forced into daylight. The arrests were clean, the kind that look almost boring to anyone who expects a chase, but boring was exactly what Jonah wanted. A boring arrest meant his kids would not hear sirens outside their bedroom window. A boring arrest meant he could go home and help Miles with a gingerbread house without scanning the street for headlights. The final weeks of the year brought paperwork, not miracles, and Jonah learned that a good ending often comes from patience instead of luck. The detectives' team verified the burglary connection through the caretaker's trail, storage payments, and the notebook's unit codes, and the coin jugs were transported under inventory to a secure evidence room where they could be photographed and sorted. Jonah was allowed to be present for part of the cataloging, not to touch evidence, but to witness the process, and he watched technicians pour coins onto counting trays under bright lights, separating common change from silver, silver from collectible, collectible from truly rare pieces. It took days because there were thousands of coins, and because the goal was accuracy, not speed. Some items, like older silver halves and certain rare pennies, matched the family's old photographs and a handwritten list the relatives dug out of a desk drawer, proving ownership beyond doubt. Those pieces were returned to the family through lawful release, and Jonah felt a surprising warmth when the elderly niece who received them shook his hand with tears in her eyes, thanking him for not selling them in panic. Not all the coins could be proven stolen, though, because mixed change loses identity, and the detective explained that unclaimed portions might be eligible for lawful release after a holding period. Jonah did not get handed a fortune on the spot, and he did not expect it anymore. What he got first was safety. The detective filed for protective orders related to the stalking, the facility increased camera coverage, and patrol cars cruised Jonah's street for a while without making a show. What he got second was dignity, a written statement from the department confirming Jonah's cooperation and good faith purchase, which mattered for his work, his reputation, and his children's peace. When the lawful release finally came for the unclaimed portion, mostly common coins plus a small set of collectible pieces without provable ties, Jonah took them to a reputable coin shop that used proper scales and offered paperwork. Then he paid taxes on the sale because he wanted a clean future more than he wanted a clever one. The money was not a fairy tale sum, but it was enough to change the temperature of his life. He replaced the furnace before the next cold snap, cleared the most punishing debt, bought Ruth a safer walker, and put a modest amount into accounts for Ava and Miles, the kind of accounts that quietly say the future is not always one emergency away from collapse. On Christmas Eve, the house felt warmer than it had in years, not just because the new furnace hummed steady, but because Jonah's shoulders finally stopped living up around his ears. Ava and Miles sprawled on the living room rug building a lopsided village of cardboard houses. Ruth dozed in her chair with the tree lights blinking softly over her hair, and Jonah stood at the sink washing dishes while the smell of cinnamon drifted through the rooms. He thought about the night the gray sedan had waited by the curb, about the message that tried to scare him into obedience, and about the moment he chose documentation over impulse even though impulse would have been easier. He did not feel like a hero and he did not need to. He felt like a father who had held the line when the line mattered, and that was enough. Later, when Ava showed him the school fundraiser page on her phone, he smiled and told her he would share it with family and leave another supportive comment for the choir, because sometimes the world stays decent only when decent people show up in small ways and keep showing up. Jonah watched his daughter's face soften at that, and he understood the moral he would carry long after the coins were sorted and the case number faded into old paperwork. The moral was not that fortune finds the brave. Fortune finds plenty of reckless people too. The moral was that integrity under pressure turns a frightening discovery into a clean second chance, and it turns a lonely life into one held up by community, receipts, and steady choices. When midnight came and the kids finally fell asleep, Jonah stepped onto the porch for a breath of cold air and looked at the quiet street, lit with holiday lights and ordinary stillness. For the first time in a long time, the darkness outside did not feel like a threat. It felt like night, the kind that ends, the kind you can trust to pass, leaving morning behind it.